for an authoritative discussion on U.S.-India relations. And we also look forward to continuing the Embassy series with the Embassy of Georgia next month. More information on these and other events can be found on the Consul's newsletter. A membership table will be open in the lobby after this presentation. As always, as a courtesy to our speakers and to the audience, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones at this time. American educational institutions have long sought to forge connections abroad, strengthening the ties between American citizens and others around the world. These programs foster the exchange of ideas in ways that traditional diplomacy cannot, building personal and cultural links between students, researchers, educators, and whole communities. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mark Pomar, President of the International Research and Exchanges Board. IREX is one of the United States' premier nonprofit international educational organizations and was founded in 1968 to administer programs dealing with advanced field research, educational exchanges, media, and internet training. It has institutional partnerships in Russia, the Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. With experience in broadcasting and as an educator himself, Dr. Pomar joined IREX in July of '94. He speaks and lectures on international education and serves as adjunct professor at the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. Please join me in welcoming our moderator and panelist, Dr. Mark Pomar.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and honored to be asked to moderate this very interesting and distinguished panel. I'm actually looking forward to hearing the remarks of the panelists myself and learning more about international education. Before I introduce the panelists, I thought I'd just say a few words about international education as I see it from my vantage point at IREX, and perhaps that might frame some of the discussion, some of the questions that will follow. It seems to me that there are four distinct areas of international education. One is the one that probably all of you know and deal with the most, which is I would call the student exchange, whether it's high school, undergraduate, graduate, whether students coming from overseas to study here, which of course is very popular, we're engaged in that, and IIE is engaged, and many other organizations, or sending Americans overseas. And that's kind of the student exchange, very popular, very interesting. We run the undergraduate and graduate exchange with the former Soviet Union, Eurasia, and we have record numbers of students applying every year to study in the United States. The second category, and one that I think is actually growing and developing, is teacher exchange. And the State Department is funding more programs to bring English teachers to the United States. We run a number of those programs where high school teachers, middle school teachers come to the United States for intensive training in terms of methodology, and then having an internship in an American high school. And of course here there's a public diplomacy element to it, because these English teachers go back and they are really the first contact for many people in those countries with the United States and with the outside world. But there's also a growing need for American-trained professors to teach overseas. And more and more universities are offering courses in English. Even places that presumably are fairly anti-American are very interested in having professors and scholars who know English well, either Americans or foreigners who know English well to teach, including places like Russia. I've come across a number of institutions in Moscow that are teaching in English and obviously want to have professors who can teach international affairs, business, law in English. The third category is one that is more professional executive education. And here USAID in Washington has been funding a number of programs. We've been involved, other organizations as well, bringing, whether they're journalists or lawyers or engineers, for executive ed experience in the United States, very often followed by internships, professional internships, where they can deal with and learn from American society as well. And the fourth category is a little bit harder to get to define, but as I would say, it's the study of international education, the study of different models of higher education around the world. And here the United States plays a very interesting role as a very successful model for how university research is done, how research is then interconnected with development, with bringing the research that a university does into the business world. And a small program that we run, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, really is intended to bring future rectors, deans, ministers of education to the United States to shadow their counterparts and learn from them, whether it's how to build a board of trustees or how to utilize the research capabilities of their university, how to work with local businesses. And we've recently been able to add China to that. And the Chinese have been very interested in this concept and actually are willing to pay most of the expenses for that, very eager to see and have their future education leaders sort of study and learn on the American experience. So those are four categories that come to my mind as I think of international education, but I'm sure this evening our speakers will greatly amplify that and probably bring in other perspectives, so we should have a very lively discussion. And now let me introduce our distinguished panel. You have their biographies, but let me just briefly introduce them. Our first speaker is Ambassador Julia Chang Bloch. She is the president of the U.S.-China Education Trust. She has served as ambassador to Nepal. She has worked in business at Bank of America. She was also the president of the U.S.-Japan Foundation, obviously a great expert on Asian issues, as well as I'm sure many others. Our second speaker is a friend and colleague, Dr. Allan Goodman, who's the president and CEO of IIE, Institute for International Education, which is the premier large educational exchange organization in the United States, the oldest, I believe, and certainly a very, very prestigious organization based in New York that runs the Fulbright program as well as 200 exchange programs on many different levels, incorporating some of the categories that I described, professional, teachers, and many others. Allan brings a distinguished experience. He served as dean and professor at Georgetown University. He has also been the recipient of many honorary degrees, and it's great to have him and share the podium with him this evening. And our third speaker is Dr. Joseph Jabbra, president of the Lebanese American University. He is a former vice president at Loyola Marymount University, has had a long and distinguished career in higher education and curriculum issues, has both a law degree and a PhD from Catholic University here in Washington. And it's wonderful to have him here as well this evening. So I will ask each of the speakers to speak roughly for 10 minutes or so. That will leave us plenty of time for questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's great to see so many young people here this evening. Yes, I hope most of you are going abroad soon. Yes? No? Well, first let me thank the World Affairs Council for organizing tonight's program. It's a topic that's very important, but has received, I think, far too little attention. And so it's great to see so many of you here this evening. Since the end of the Cold War, the value of education and public diplomacy has receded in importance and lost resonance with our government and much of our foreign policy community. While 9/11 renewed interest in education exchange, as well as the study of critical need languages, where are the resources? After World War II, our leaders understood that the challenges of the Cold War required the United States to win the hearts and minds of the people around the world. And they invested in education exchange to make America competitive. I'll ask the other speakers on the panel to address the issue of whether we are competitive today. I have a few comments as well. But during the Cold War, the height of the Cold War in 1957, Sputnik activated a strong U.S. public diplomacy agenda, spurring this country to unprecedented levels of investment in education, not just in science and technology, but in languages, the social sciences, and international studies. Advancing education and exchange made a powerful difference. In marked contrast, the national response to this century's defining event thus far, 9/11, has not been to enhance investments in education and public diplomacy that build our capacity to understand and bridge religious, cultural, or national boundaries, Instead, we have let U.S. competitiveness decline, allowing funding for education exchange programs to drop, at the same time increasing barriers to international exchange, tolerating dismal rates of U.S. student participation in study abroad, although there's good news that the numbers are increasing, saddling ourselves with a critical shortage of Americans with foreign language skills, and dismantling USIA, the agency charged with leading our public diplomacy efforts. Joseph Nye, Harvard professor and former Assistant Secretary of Defense, who made soft power a foreign policy idiom, wrote in a 2004 Foreign Affairs article that the entire budget for public diplomacy had been slashed to $1.2 billion. I believe it's gone up some recently, or roughly 0.3% of the annual Defense Department budget, and about what McDonald's spends on advertising. It is as if emerging after the Cold War as the sole global superpower, America decided that the defense of U.S. interests and the effective management of global conflict would neither require Americans with a broad understanding of the world, nor a world that understood the U.S. That American leadership no longer depended on building ties with the next generation leaders of major powers, that our engagement with other nations no longer required mutual awareness of cultural diversity and a recognition of shared values as well as differences. We should have known better. The collapse of America's standing in the world is a clear indictment of our neglect of education, exchange, and public diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, nowhere is the need for winning hearts and minds greater than in the People's Republic of China. The relationship between the United States and China, I am convinced, is the most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century. As Henry Kissinger put it, how the U.S. relates to China in this century will determine whether our children will live in turmoil, even worse than the 20th century, or whether they will witness a new world order compatible with universal aspirations for peace and progress. Given the history of U.S.-China relations, a cornerstone of that relationship must be founded on mutual understanding and trust, which requires a long-term investment in education exchange between our two countries. Yet, the bulk of the paltry public diplomacy budget noted by Joseph Nye is committed to the Muslim countries. While I applaud the reassertion of public diplomacy to break down the barriers of misunderstanding between Americans and Muslims, it is short-sighted that more attention is not being paid to China. It is folly to wait until the point of no return, as in the Middle East, before acting. The U.S.-China relationship is patently too important to be relegated to a sideshow of our Mideast public diplomacy. No one understood that better than Senator William Fulbright, the author of the program that bears his name, who said perhaps the greatest power of educational exchange is the power to convert nations into peoples and to translate ideologies into aspirations. How many of you here are or have been Fulbright? Professors, students? Only a few. Well, you should look into it. It is a tribute to the strength and resilience of American education that it remains a magnet despite dwindling resources for students and aspiring leaders around the world. While Chinese applications for student visas began a decline in FY 2003, it is bouncing back. We've become, again, the #1 choice for Chinese students. Why? Because of the falling dollar. American education, higher education, now is more than ever a bargain. Moreover, China has taken American education as a model in its massive expansion and reform of the country's higher education system. Premier institutions like Peking University, the Harvard of China, are experimenting with new curricula, like the Yuanpei Honors Program, which offers select students a more American-style liberal arts education, rather than the strict early specialization of traditional Chinese post-secondary education. The history of American education in China is worth recounting as a lesson of what education and exchange can contribute to diplomacy. Because of time limitations, I won't go into all the ins and outs, except to say that the first Chinese student to come to America was Yongwing in 1847. He became the first Chinese to graduate from Yale and from any, probably, foreign university from China. When he returned to China, he created a Chinese educational mission to bring more Chinese students to the United States. And the Qing dynasty agreed to it, to the mission. And this was 136 years ago. They brought 120 Chinese boys, and I stress boys, to the United States to study. But the program was terminated because conservative Confucians in the government felt these young Chinese boys had become too Americanized, you know, dancing, playing sports, and even dating. So they terminated the program, and the flow of Chinese students to the United States did not begin again until 1909. Has anyone here heard of the Boxer Indemnity Fund or the Boxer Scholarships? Not a one. You've heard about it. Well, you've heard of the Boxer Rebellion. When China was defeated, this was back in 1900, and as a penalty, China was assessed a huge indemnity that was almost, I think, more than twice the amount of its revenues. And China had to pay this indemnity to the 8 countries who defeated China. And the United States was included among them. But the United States was the only country to remit a portion of that indemnity back to China to create a student fund after it assessed its own damages. So there was no loss there. And the person who was responsible for bringing this about was one of the last Chinese students to come to this country under the last Chinese mission. His name was Liang Chen. And what he did was to persuade President Roosevelt. And how did he do that? He had been at Andover, and he was a star baseball player. And President Theodore Roosevelt was at Exeter. And President Roosevelt remembered Liang Chen when he came to this country as China's minister to Washington. And he remembered that that was the guy who hit a 3-base homer that defeated the Exeter squad. So that helped to pave the way for America agreeing to the Boxer Indemnity Fund and to the scholarships. But of course, Liang Chen also understood the United States, because this is what he said in trying to lobby the U.S. government. The American government will be pleased to gain a reputation of being just and to bear witness to the development of talent through education. And most of the country will welcome this lofty goal to use for educational purposes the money that is already allocated for indemnity, would create benefit from damage and gain from loss. The act would heighten China's morale, lay a foundation for the nation's resurgence, and lift us from humiliation. And of course he was right. In 1908, when the Senate passed the resolution, the New York Times said, "The Boxer Indemnity Fund is an example to the world for its principles of right and justice and high-mindedness that prevail between honorable men." Again, I wonder where the women have been. And Edwin James, president of the University of Illinois, wrote to Roosevelt more practically. He said, "The nation which succeeds in educating the young Chinese of the present generation will be the nation which, for a given expenditure of effort, will reap the largest possible returns in morale, intellectual, and commercial influence. The extension of such moral influence would mean a larger return for a given outlay than could be obtained in any other manner. Trade follows moral and spiritual domination." I don't know that we use the word domination, "far more inevitably than it follows the flag." Are we not also doing this today with international education? And James was right on the money. The Boxer Indemnity Fund not only established the Tsinghua School, today's Tsinghua University or MIT of China, but it created a reservoir of goodwill that has withstood the vicissitudes of U.S.-China relations among the Chinese people. I know because my father was among the second contingent of Boxer scholars sent to study in America in 1911, the year the Qing dynasty was toppled and the Republic of China was founded. So what happened to the Boxer scholars like my father? Well, because of time again, let me just say a little bit about my father. He was the first Chinese to graduate from Harvard Law School, and he was the first Chinese to oversee the Chinese Maritime Customs Service. And he reformed and nationalized the foreign administration of that service, and also helped to return tariff autonomy back to China. But I also must mention another Boxer returnee, because these returnees were the foundation of China's modernization. But the one that is probably best known in the West is Hu Shi. Anybody heard of him? Yes? No? Maybe. Anyway, Hu Shi first went to Cornell, but he got his PhD from Columbia because he didn't want to study agriculture. He was a leading liberal intellectual of the New Culture movement, which advocated saving China through cultural transformation. He became a diplomat, also president of Peking University, and he also served under the Nationalists as ambassador to the United States. But his greatest contribution was to revolutionize China's language. He made it possible for Baihua, or for the vernacular Chinese, to be written. So literature from 1917 on began to be written in the vernacular, and it escaped the hold that classics, Chinese classics had, which allowed the average people to access education. So he did more in one stroke by that move than all military operations or armies or revolutions could accomplish. He democratized China more than anything else. So let me just say that when I was invited in 1998 by Peking University to teach and to revive its American Studies Center in celebration of its centennial, it also happened to be the 80th anniversary of my father's appointment as a lecturer of international law at the university, his first job. So how could I not accept? And I decided that the increasing popularization of U.S. foreign policy allowed me, as an individual, to make a difference in the all-important U.S.-China relationship, that I could turn myself into a vehicle of international education for China's best and the brightest, the students of the premier institutions of China. Today, the U.S.-China Education Trust works with a network of 31 of China's premier universities and institutes. So there are 22 million Chinese university students, and the population is growing. The most that the U.S.-China Education Trust can touch is maybe a few thousand. So there's so much more that needs to be done. Still, I am, finally, a strong believer in the power of education exchange. During two of the blackest periods in recent U.S.-China relations, the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and of course no Chinese believes it was an accident, and the downing of the U.S. spy plane on Hainan Island. I was on the campus of Peking University while students, including some of my own, marched against the U.S. embassy in protest. No one closed down my classes or programs. My friendships with colleagues and students also remained unchanged as before. And ladies and gentlemen, the intrinsic value of education and exchange is that government-to-government relations may go up and down, but people-to-people relations, because of education, exchange, and public diplomacy, endure. Thank you very much.
A vibrant intellectual community, a vibrant university, and I'm so glad that it's got a terrific leader. And I wanted to particularly come to this panel because Julia is responsible for the only personnel decision I ever made as a baby dean that was right. I asked Julia and her friend Susan Connor, who was then the General Counsel of the Pan American Health Organization, to come and help me evaluate our graduate program at Georgetown. And they both said it was pretty good, could do with a little improvement. And I guess you have a sense now that Julia is a pretty retiring, shy person. She said, yeah, you ought to maybe think of even having a woman teach at Georgetown. I didn't forget that. Our first hire was Madeleine Albright. And the rest is history, but I've never had a chance to thank you for pushing me to push the guys to open the doors to make sure that foreign service is for all. I am, in Mark's terminology, a Category 1 speaker. I represent that part of international education which deals with educational exchange. And whether it's the flagship Fulbright program which we administer on behalf of the Department of State, or the Erasmus program which the European Union maintains for the world now, or the campus that Georgetown has built in Education City in Doha, all of these programs promote in some degree a quality that Julia summarized at the end is so valuable, that of mutual understanding. And they are, as Senator Fulbright recognized early on, maybe the best investment any of us can make in making the world a less dangerous place. So while the four of us speak from different perspectives or categories, we actually all, I think, feel we're contributing to make the world less dangerous, and that is what international education does these days. Now, it needs three things, which are in not necessarily short supply, but it needs three things that everyone here needs to advocate for. One is it has to be sustained. Fulbright is a government program. It begins with your taxes. And in the new Congress, there will be many other demands on the government's budget and many promises to keep, no matter who is elected. In other countries and in other parliaments, they face similar situations, whether it's the Marshall Scholars in England or the Erasmus program in the European Union. All of us as a community need to speak to our world and to our parliaments and to our leaders about the need to sustain international educational exchange in all the forms that it takes represented on this panel. Secondly, it requires mobility. People, students and scholars need to move around the world freely. Julia mentioned how important it is to do when relations between countries are bad. One of the things we learned after 9/11 is that in difficult times, actually, students and scholars are more willing to travel, are more willing to promote mutual understanding, are more willing to understand what's going on than in easy times. And so as we think about the future, our immigration policy, our visa policies, the policies of the French government, of the German government, of the Australian government, of the Chinese government, of all the governments that have a say in who crosses borders, are not only matters of foreign policy, but they're matters of international education. Academic open doors, something that's relatively recent in the history of academia, is important for all of us to sustain, whether we're Americans or citizens of any other country. And happily, the numbers are going up, and happily, I think we've turned the corner on decline in America. Third, we need to assure that we don't only educate and provide study abroad opportunities for the few who are rich, because there are many who are poor. And we need to widen educational access in our own country. We need to widen the opportunity for students in our own country who don't have the means to study abroad through programs like the Benjamin Gilman Scholarship, which gives to any student on a Pell Grant an additional $5,000 so that they can study abroad. And we need to encourage other governments to make sure, and other countries to make sure, that as higher education expands, it isn't only for the men, it isn't only for the people born in Beijing, it isn't only for people who are the sons and daughters of the people that can afford to go to prep schools to learn English, but we make an accommodation so that education, higher education, and international education increases in the diversity of all who have the opportunity to achieve it. Now, the United States is the world's leading destination for international students. About 600,000 international students now are studying in the United States. That represents about 22% of all students anywhere in the world going anywhere. That's the good news. The bad news, in a sense, is that 5 countries account for almost 80% of international enrollments: America, France, Germany, Australia, and Great Britain. We have to look to a world where international education is more than those 5 countries. And of the 600,000 students studying in America, half, 300,000, go to just 150 colleges and universities, and we probably could name them right here in this room. I often meet students abroad who think America only has 3 universities: Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford. And it's a little difficult to explain to a parent and student why it's very difficult to study veterinary medicine at Harvard or agronomy at Princeton. Those schools don't have that. The fact is, America has 4,000 accredited colleges and universities. Accredited colleges and universities. That represents about 1/3 of all the institutions of higher education in the entire world, and 2/3 of all the people who are called faculty who teach in institutions of higher education in the whole world. No other country has the capacity to absorb international students as America does, and yet only about 3% of our total enrollment is international. So as more and more people are given access to higher education, and as we I hope, are able to change the paradigm so that everybody thinks that study abroad ought to be part of everybody's education. More and more of these students and scholars will have the chance to come to the United States. So it's going to take a special effort on our part, because we, in a sense, have an educational trust of the whole world in our hands, to make sure that our doors remain open, that mobility gets promoted, that access gets widened, and that we continue into the next and many other administrations into realizing that international education is both a way to promote mutual understanding and to make the world less dangerous. Thank you very much.
Good evening to all of you. What I like to do is really to touch upon 6 major points very, very briefly. Beginning with a quote. A.G. Wells once said, human history is a race between education and catastrophe. And there is nowhere else in the world where this statement is more applicable than in the Middle East, that is facing incredible problems, let's say challenges at the present time. You have the Palestinian-Israeli issue. It's 60 years old, and there is no end in sight. You have the Iraq war, and we don't know where we stand on it. You have the Iranian nuclear situation, and it's a major challenge for the entire world. You have the question of minorities, and no one knows how to address them. The Kurds, the Armenians, the Shiites, the Christian, and so on and so forth. And of course, you have the whole issue of globalization that constitutes at the present time a major challenge for the entire Middle East. Now, all these issues are very, very complex, and they're disputed issues. But there is one major issue that there is no dispute about nor doubt about, and that is education. In order really to help that area change, and change for the better, then obviously we have to provide the people of that region with the opportunity to get an education that is second to none. We have to provide the opportunity for citizens in that part of the world to become educated and engaged in their respective societies. We have to provide youth in that part of the world with the opportunity to become educated. Let me mention one figure to you which is absolutely overwhelming. The World Bank has put out statistics that in the next few decades you will have 80 million young people coming on the market in that part of the world. And we're not sure that that part of the world is ready for them. We're not sure if the entire world is ready for them. But there are always signs of hope. And American higher education is doing a tremendous job in that part of the world. As some of you might know, there are 3 major American institutions, not branches, but American institutions in that part of the world. There is AUB, the American University of Beirut. There is AUC, the American University of Cairo. And there is LAU, Lebanese American University. And each of these institutions has been functioning for years and years. in that part of the world. Educating people. Just to give you an idea, that when the Charter of the United Nations was ratified, 19 of the original signers were graduates of American universities in the Middle East. Incredible, incredible statistics. Now, I'm president of LAU, and let me say a few words about that institution. LAU was established in 1835 by a bunch of Presbyterian adventurers who thought that they were going to make a difference in the world by establishing a school for the education of women in the Ottoman Empire. An incredible, incredible challenge. Well, they took on that challenge and they succeeded, ladies and gentlemen. LAU is the product of that endeavor. At the turn of the century, it became the American Junior College in Beirut. And it evolved into a full-fledged institution which has two major campuses, the mother campus in Beirut and another campus in Byblos, about 35 kilometers north of Beirut. And we have 7,000 students, ladies and gentlemen. 20% of our student body comes from 86 countries in the world, including the United States. Very, very important to keep that in mind. We have 6 major schools: arts and science, business, which is the largest in the region and the best, of course, the School of Pharmacy, which is the only accredited school of pharmacy outside the United States, and pharmaceutical concerns in the United States wait for graduation time, and they go there and hire all our graduates. The School of Medicine, which is very, very important, engineering and architecture. We can't graduate enough engineers and architects. Very, very important. And of course, the School of Nursing that we're putting in place in association with Northeastern University. We are, ladies and gentlemen, in race with time. Why? Because we need, whether we like it or not, we need to bridge the knowledge gap in that part of the world. We need to bridge the technology gap. We need to help develop the intellectual capital, the human capital that successive generations in that part of the world do need. Very, very important. And we need to contribute and to work with the youth of that part of the world in order to establish civil society everywhere we can. Why should we do that? Why should Americans support American education abroad? Well, for 3 simple reasons, and I'll end with that. First, from an altruistic reason, it's very, very important to support American education abroad, because as Americans, we love to help other people. We love to make sure that other people succeed, that people can live comfortably. The second one is selfish. Of course, we'd like to promote understanding between the United States and other parts of the world, not only the Middle East, China, as well as Eastern Europe, as other parts of the world. And the more we invest in American education abroad, the better it's going to be for the Americans. Not only for the other side, but for the Americans as well. And thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, it's a hell of a lot cheaper to sustain American education abroad than to sustain war. Thank you very, very much.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers for very interesting, very lively, and very informative presentations. Before I open it up to questions, I'd like to just raise an example, another example that echoes what Julia so eloquently described in terms of China. The predecessor organization to IREX, the one that we succeeded, was called the Inter-University Committee on Exchanges. And the first year of exchanges in 1958, a young, very ambitious, very trusted scholar from Russia came by the name of Alexander Yakovlev. Does that name mean anything to anyone? Yes. Yeah. I have a picture of him in my office, in my file, standing on the steps of Low Library at Columbia University. He came on the first exchange in 1958. His advisor was Richard Hofstadter, but in his memoirs he writes that he actually spent little time studying American history with Hofstadter. He spent most of his time in Butler Library reading all the forbidden books that the Soviet Union would not allow. And years went on, he had a successful career, and he became the father of glasnost and perestroika and Gorbachev's mentor, and probably played a bigger role in the dismantling of the Soviet Union and in the end of the Cold War than any other individual in the Soviet Union. He then, afterwards, after 1991, went on to start an intensive archival publication of the crimes of the Soviet Union, the 1930s, the purges, the Gulag system, and just died a few years ago as really a great hero. Anyway, his exchange experience in the United States in 1958 obviously allowed him to develop that way. So there are probably many examples of this nature that we can look to. And now, please, questions. If you could just identify yourself and to whom you're directing the question.
I'll just mention to you that we have two major prominent American high schools in Beirut, International College and American Community High School, and they're doing extremely well. And I'm sure some kind of relationship between them and the high schools here would be most welcome.
You're probably referring to one of the schools here, Sidwell Friends, because that school has a long-standing exchange program with Fudan University's high school in China, in Shanghai. But I think the area where high school students, maybe even younger students, need to get involved in international education is in languages, because especially in this country we have so few Americans who know more than one language. And there's now a great surge of interest certainly in Chinese. And the Chinese government has started what they call the Confucius Institutes. There are a few around this area. One of them is at the University of Maryland, College Park. And what they're doing is they're sending out Chinese students to teach the Chinese language. They're also sending more Chinese students to those high schools are more likely to take the Chinese Chinese language teachers than universities. But there are all kinds of certification problems. Nevertheless, I think in the language area, because you can't start at the university level. I mean, to learn Chinese is a lifelong commitment. So if you don't start when you're young, it's very difficult. The Chinese start their English training in 3rd grade, beginning in 3rd grade. I have a little niece. She's only 6. She knows her ABCs. She knows English words. Why? Because in preschool they started teaching her English. So I think that's where, and by the way, there's also money there, I'm told, because we are now, the president had an initiative to promote the study of difficult languages or these languages like Chinese and Arabic. So, anyway.
If I can just jump in and say there was that Senator Bill Bradley several years ago was very instrumental in starting a high school exchange program with the former Soviet Union. And to this day, the high school program functions. There are fairly symbolic efforts, but nonetheless, they are around and they have been functioning well. Let me take a stab at Iran. I had a chance to go to Iran a few years ago and to actually talk about starting up exchange programs, because at one point Iran had more exchange students in the United States than any other country in the world back in the 70s. And what I discovered was that the generation, let's say my age and older, had studied in the United States, and there were actually departments that were formed by PhDs from Berkeley or Harvard or Stanford, and they very much wanted their students to come and study, mostly the sciences. We're talking about biology, chemistry, physics. It's impossible to do for political reasons, but I think the interest in Iran today to have graduate students studying in the United States is very, very high. And I would hope personally that the opportunity would be for exchanges to reestablish themselves, because I think they would be very, very welcomed. So they indeed had careers, and these people have had excellent careers in the sciences, having studied in the United States.
I think a lot of those graduates from USC at the present time, with some exceptions with respect to some countries. But if you take a look at the Gulf, for example, area, in Bahrain, for example, you have those who are, in charge, really, of the country. They're graduates of the United States, not only USC, but other parts of other universities in the United States. In Saudi Arabia, the Saudization program has allowed those who graduated from the United States, really universities in the United States, to be in top positions at the present time in Saudi Arabia. The same applies to the United Arab Emirates. I mean, some of the work that is being done in the United Arab Emirates in public policy, for example, in public administration, at the level of the cabinet, at the level of the ministries, is just absolutely incredible. I know the program you're talking about. I think the person who's still in charge of it at the present time is Gerald Kaiden at the University of Southern California. but those who graduated from there, with no exceptions, do have highly respected positions, and they're contributing really to the development of the institutions, political institutions in their respective countries. Certainly in some cases, you know, some of them did return because they were not welcome. But in the majority of cases, they're working very, very hard really to advance their country at the present time. I'd like to make one very, very important comment. You know, people out there in the Middle East may disagree with American foreign policy, but they continue to flock to American institutions because they love to have an American degree. So, and they're very astute. They make a distinction between our foreign policy and the American people, the American education, what it stands for, the values of higher education in the United States. And that's very, very important to keep in mind. I mean, you know, our enrollment is skyrocketing, despite the fact that at the present time you get a lot of negativity coming from that part of the world about American foreign policy. But enrollment in American institutions is just incredible. It's an all-time high.
I'm glad you had that opportunity and appreciate your service in the Peace Corps. I wish it were double in size so that more people could do that. It's not only the government that has to reach out to parents and students abroad. We as educators have to go abroad and say, our campuses are open, we welcome Muslim students. Yes, the visa process is different today than it was before 9/11, but it's the easiest part of applying to American colleges and universities. Think about what you had to do to apply to college. You had to take all these tests. You had to write essays about what 3 books you take on a desert island. You had to get letters of recommendation. And if you're a foreign student, you need to register to get a TOEFL. And pretty hard to get in here, and we don't have a central system. The visa form is probably the easiest thing you fill out, but we have to make sure people fill it out plenty of time, so that if they need extra time to be checked, it doesn't interfere with them coming here. So it's not just the government having to make it more transparent. I think we had, before 9/11, a view that if we built it, they'd come. We have 4,000 schools. They're all quite good. And 9/11 was a wake-up call. That's not going to happen unless we go abroad ourselves and say, as deans and professors and presidents, that foreign students are genuinely welcome on American campuses. Happily, more and more college and university officials have done that, and I think that contributed to the increase in the numbers this year, but I think it's very important to sustain. Well, I've never had that question before. I think whether it's China or Chile, people want the best for their children they possibly can get. And American higher education has been equated with high quality. Last year, the European Union did a survey of 20,000 students. Why did they study in America, or why did they study in Europe? And the news was disappointing to the European Union, because 76% said they wanted to go to America. And why? It's because of both the quality and the innovation associated with education here. You can enter in one field and switch to another. You can find yourself. You can get the appropriate education for yourself. You can take a time out. You don't lose status. You can go back. You can transfer schools. So a lot of those are very appealing and unique to our system. I think people generally value education highly. The more, the better. And in most developing countries, they've had to make huge investments in just completing primary education. They haven't had the chance to invest in higher education. Or you have a situation like the University of Cairo. It was built for 50,000 students. Now has 250,000. It's quite possible to go to school at the University of Cairo and never see a professor, never enter a classroom. So there's a shortage, and I think that drives people more and more to think about coming to our country and getting our degrees. Thank you for your question.
But I think you were asking that there's a differential in value of the degree. And it's not just the United States. I think what you're really talking about is protectionism. Did you read recently in the Washington Post, this article about Germany? How Germany has a law that says that you cannot be addressed as doctor if you got your PhD anywhere else but in Germany. And this was a big brouhaha because there were some very prominent, eminent American doctors or PhDs who had been teaching or in some research institute forever. And after 30 years, this law just was, opened up, and these people were going to be prosecuted because apparently it's a crime. That is taking this notion of educational protectionism to the nth degree. But I'm very much aware, for example, that China is much more open to international education, not just American, than, for example, our ally Japan. Japan does not recognize foreign degrees. And if you are a foreign educational institution, for example, Temple University has had a law program in Japan forever. I was on its board. But they operated a school that was not formally recognized by the Ministry of Education. But recently, I think, they worked out something. So I think there's nothing else but protectionism.
If I can just quickly add that my experience dealing with Russians in the United States is that America is very open to degrees, and many Russian scholars have very prestigious appointments here. There's a joke that goes around that the math department at Princeton University could hold its meetings either in English or in Russian. So I think that there's quite a bit of openness to them.
We're trying to do it, really. There's another thing I want to mention to you, just for information, there are 4 American schools in Lebanon. There are 2 universities, American universities, and 2 high schools. And those get about $10 million in terms of, support for scholarships. Now what's happening is that they're saying we're not going to give them $10 million. We're going to slash that back to 4.5. And the scholarship used to go to those people who cannot really afford to come to an American institution or to go to an American high school, and they're very well qualified, and they're given that opportunity. The university now, LAU, gives about $10 million on a yearly basis for financial aid, because we believe that this is the only way to make sure that the mix of the student population continues to be really from everywhere, not only geographic, but as well socioeconomic.
Visa, is still a very serious one.
There are 2 dimensions to the gentleman's question. One is visas, and I think I've addressed my comments generally to the improvement that's taking place. The second part of his question is, how can people from other countries afford our prices? It's the same question that many Americans ask. And one of the answers they found is that they begin in community college, and through the articulation agreement, they then go to the state university. The average age of a freshman in America last year, of a first-year university student, was 29. A third of them had a kid already. Our higher education system is designed to serve people at all levels in the economic picture. But there is not enough money for international students, especially from Africa, to come and study in our country at our prices. And I hope that foundations, I hope that corporations, I hope that people that do business with Africa And I hope the governments of Africa will make it possible for those companies to provide money, as Senator Fulbright started, for educational exchange, rather than direct payments to the Ministry of Petroleum, direct payments to the Ministry of Trade, direct payments to the Customs Bureau. That would help a lot. I also wish we could do debt relief and debt swaps and swap debt for educational scholarships so that people could come here, or the American University of Cairo, which is in Africa, could have a branch campus in another part of Africa. And I think that's a wonderful thing to explore. If the American University of Kazakhstan, of Bulgaria, the Lebanese American University, if there were resources to establish branch campuses, I think that would be important to do, and Africa would be a high priority for me.
Definitely. In fact, today I was reviewing applications for our first Summer Institute program in the United States for Chinese professors who teach about the U.S. And we have, I think I mentioned, a network of 31 universities, mostly universities, who are members of the U.S.-China Education Trust's American Studies Network. So in terms of our applications, we received 35. We can grant 12. Of the 35 applications, it came from across the country because when I said usual suspects, or the usual ones, it's the Peking University, Fudan University, Tsinghua University. They get all the opportunities because they're the best known. I mean, they're like the Harvard, Columbia, and let me see, I said MIT of the United States. We do a lot of programs with those universities as well because they're easiest. And, you know, Shanghai and Beijing, people want to go to. Now, does anybody want to go to Wuhan? Well, fewer people are interested. But I would be very happy to share with you our network. We have universities throughout the country. We had, for example, 6 applications from Sichuan. There are about 3 universities that we work with in Sichuan. We had an application from Yunnan. We have a special scholarship program. Yunnan is one of the poorest provinces of China. And we have a special scholarship program for the poorest of the poor students to go to university in China. The Chinese don't want them to come to the United States because many of them, the poor ones, they can't adjust or they don't want to go back. Then, for example, as I said, I mentioned Wuhan, I mentioned Xi'an, Guangdong. I mean, so I'll be happy to share them. Share the list with you. You pay for everything. Then I can. You pay what? Who pays for everything? Boeing is paying for. This is a small price for Boeing to pay for the number of planes that the Chinese buy from Boeing. If they pay for everything, I guarantee you. How many applicants do you want? I'll deliver them to you. You're asking about Chinese diplomacy. Okay.
I think the way you could probably most easily find out is to go to the Department of State and their website for the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and that will describe the variety of programs like Fulbright, which are investments, and it will talk about new initiatives, and there have been new initiatives in Pakistan, there are new initiatives in Chile, new initiatives in the Middle East. There's a very new initiative with Chile in science and technology, and also with Pakistan, and those will be announced by the government, and the government is making these investments in this aspect of educational exchange. Thank you.